Good morning, everybody. My name is Kira Durston. I'm the Market Development Agronomist for Moose Jaw, Congress, Rowett area. Today I got a special request to go through the different considerations that I think about when I'm planning somebody's fertilizer. So we'll get started. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the different things that I consider for fertilizer. I also thought it would be good if we talked about the results from the soil samples we've been getting and kind of talk about the trends overall for the area. I thought I'd talk about how I'm kind of recommending to address those deficiencies. Wanted to touch on sulfur fertilization a little bit because there's a lot of products out there. There's a lot of ideas out there. So I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts. And then I also just wanted to talk about the 4R nutrient stewardship that you're probably hearing more and more about. And then at the end, if anyone has any specific examples or anything that they want to run through, we can go through that together as well. So we'll get started. Okay, so what do I think about when I'm planning somebody's fertilizer? There's a lot of things to consider, but some of the most prevalent things that I think about would be probably the soil texture or the cation exchange capacity or the different soil characteristics, including the soil pH. I think about what does the grower want to achieve, what kind of yield are they looking to get, and then I also consider the different machinery or storage capabilities on the farm as well. Well, first of all, start talking about the cation exchange capacity, which is really related to soil texture. To me, this is kind of like the ability for your soil to build nutrient levels. The cation exchange capacity of a soil is the ability for the soil to hold on to positively charged ions. So what that really means is all of our soil has a charge and all of our nutrients have a charge, and pretty much everything we put into the soil has some sort of charge. So depending on the charge, it's kind of like a magnet. So it's the ability of the soil to kind of hold on to different things. So if you have a low cation exchange capacity, that means that you're probably less likely to hold on to things, which means that you're more likely to see loss to leaching. So an example of a low cation exchange capacity soil would be maybe that sandier soil, whereas if you have a high CEC, that usually means you have a lot more clay because clay can bind on to things a lot easier. So if you have a low CEC soil and you're more prone to leaching, typically I steer away from maybe fall applied nitrogen because you'll see a lot higher losses. I might consider more split applications of nitrogen just because you'll want to maybe feed the crop a little bit more with a low CEC soil. I also might look at when I'm building sulfur levels, typically even the source of the sulfur that I'm going to decide, it'll be based on the CEC. So since you'll see more leaching, I'll maybe look at more elemental or not even building on the low CEC soils, those kinds of things. And another mobile nutrient would probably be boron. We typically see more boron deficiencies on low CEC soils as well. So just to summarize, low CEC soils might need smaller amounts of fertilizer more often, whereas high CEC soils are capable of being more built up because the nutrients aren't lost. And so you can kind of see those levels improve over the years, whereas a low CEC soil, you might get frustrated because you're fertilizing and you're taking your soil sample results and you're saying, well, why aren't I building anything? That's probably why. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Just to show you guys, we use AgVice for our soil test results, so I know where it is on that. But typically your soil test result will probably try to predict what kind of texture that you have. And so that's right down here, this cation exchange capacity rating in the red there. And they'll write it in the general comments as well. Like, for example, they predicted that this was a medium textured soil just based off of the CEC rating. I would just warn everyone that if you have a really high pH, like as your pH gets above 7.6, the cation exchange capacity that is calculated at the lab can be kind of skewed. So that will just, you know, you have that level and they kind of tell you what it is, but you know, and the lab does. So just kind of understand Is it sandier? Is there more clay? And just kind of go off of that as well. So the next thing that I typically consider is the soil pH. This kind of decides how much availability of nutrients that you'll have. Our pH is typically around that 7 or higher. We are starting to see a little bit more acidic soils, especially in the top depth, around that like 6.5. And that's just because fertilizer tends to kind of change the pH in your soil as well. So since we're not tilling as much, we're kind of seeing that fertilizer band where we're putting fertilizer every year. So it is kind of starting to alter the pH of our soil as well. So you will maybe see that 6.5 in the top depth and maybe that 7.2 in the bottom depth. And that's really, it's common. We're seeing a lot of it. So if you notice that your pH is all of a sudden changing, that. But typically our pH is a lot higher just because of the parent material of our soil. What our soil formed from was very calcareous. It had a lot of calcium in it. And this calcium tends to bind a lot with phosphorus and zinc. So that kind of changes the way we fertilize and also our sources of fertilizer. It's kind of recommended on our high pH soils that we want to avoid calcium-based fertilizer products. The way that you can kind of tell if they're calcium-based is if they advertise a low salt index, usually that means that they're calcium-based. So that's something to watch out for, just because we already have a lot of calcium in our soil. It's already causing binding issues with our phosphorus and our zinc. So I wouldn't want to add more calcium, especially if it was a calcium-based phosphorus product. The other thing that you can do to kind of minimize this binding or this tying up is don't broadcast the nutrients that aren't available at that high pH. You want to try and minimize the exposure to the soil, and we really recommend to place those with the seed so that it's kind of all concentrated. It's close to the seedling, close to the roots, so it's less likely to get bound up in the soil. And so some of the nutrients that I would say would be those phosphorus, zinc, even copper, and even boron on those higher pH soils above 7.5. So this is a table that kind of talks about where the optimal level is for your pH to have that nutrient available. So if you're noticing that maybe you're seeing a little bit of deficiency in something, or you're wondering why maybe this little patch in the field isn't producing as good, it could be because you're experiencing some kind of deficiency, even just based off the pH. Does anybody have questions on that? Okay, so soil pH and nitrogen. So if you have those higher pH soils, which is typical for our area, you will also see a higher risk of injury from seed-placed urea. So if you have a pH of above 8 even, I would say those seed safe rates, that maybe you want to consider that a little bit more if you're noticing your emergence isn't as good. And you'll also see higher losses due to volatilization. And so pretty much that's just the loss of nitrogen into the air. So you're going to make sure that you're putting your fertilizer in the ground on those high pH soils. You're not going to want to broadcast them. If you are, you're going to want to use a safener because you will see the higher losses from that. On the contrary, on the lower pH soils, typically you'll see compromised nitrogen fixation in pulses. And that's just because the high aluminum and manganese that's in a low pH is toxic for the rhizobia bacteria. And also calcium is really good for nodulation as well. So if you don't have those high levels of calcium, you might see that. But that really depends on the strain of the rhizobia and the crop. But if you happen to have acidic soil, watch out for your inoculant. So the other things that I consider when I'm planning somebody's fertilizer is their yield goals. So I just kind of want to touch on the difference between uptake and removal rates. So uptake rates are what the crop needs to take up in order to achieve a certain yield goal. So this is what I use when I'm trying to calculate if someone says, I want to get 65 bushel canola. And I say, okay, well, this is the kind of nutrients that we'll need in that soil to get that. So I'll use this value especially for nutrients that are fast movers. So for example, nitrogen. So I do consider soil sample results with this, just kind of seeing, okay, we have this much nitrogen in the soil already, and this is how much we need. So then I kind of adjust my rate based on that. And then on the other side of it is the removal rate. And this is what the crop actually takes off the field in the grain. So this is what I use when I want to maintain a certain amount of nutrients in the field. So this is good for nutrients that require a long time to build. So for example, phosphorus, even potassium. The soil sample results aren't necessarily used as calculators for this type of value. It's more as a good check-in to say, okay, have I been putting enough down based on removal rates? If you're seeing a big decrease in your phosphorus levels, maybe that means that you're not really accounting for those removal rates enough, and so you need to maybe bump it up a little bit. So yeah, the uptake value is typically higher than the removal value because it takes more up and then it kind of leaves some in the field, whereas the removal is what's just taken off. So just to show you the difference between them, a 50 bushel canola crop will take off. You can see the uptake values here and the removal values here. So yeah. Anyone have questions on that? And just to show you guys what uptake and removal rates I typically use, this is a really good chart that you can find. I'll maybe send it out in a follow-up email. It's from Taurus Ag, but it's consistent with the Yara values. It's consistent with a lot of IPNI charts as well. So it'll just show you the uptake and the removal. And just note that the micronutrients, the reason why they're measured in grams instead of pounds is because the amount of pounds are really low. And so to make it look a little bit less zero-y, they put it in grams. So if you look here, it looks very low, but actually like this is half a pound of zinc. But yeah, so that's why it's in grams. Makes it a little bit harder to calculate how much you need to, but we can help you with those conversions as well if you need. Okay, moving on to machinery capabilities. So it's really important to really watch how much fertilizer you're putting with your seed. Really watch your emergence, take your plant stand counts, because it's actually, even though they release this guideline and they say you can put this much down, it really varies by the field and it really varies by the soil texture and the history. And so it's kind of like every farm has their own pretty much. So this is a good place to start. And it's a good place to kind of start to evaluate, okay, am I getting the plant stand targets that I want? This rate is definitely going to change per farm. We watch that. We ask about emergence. We talk about, you know, how much is that fertilizer being spread out in the seed bed, just to make sure that nobody's getting toxicity. Because what really happens is fertilizer has a really high salt index. And so what it does is it really likes moisture. So it's like a sponge for moisture. So when you put it with your seed, it's taking all the moisture that your seed needs to imbibe and germinate. So that's why fertilizer can be toxic for seed. So yeah, just watch out for that. The other thing that we kind of consider when we're calculating fertilizer rates is we like to try and figure out the tanks so that we're utilizing all of them and we're trying to reduce the number of fills. So we'll maybe change our sources or our rates based on that, where we're going to put blends and stuff. And the other thing that we'll consider is storage capabilities. How many products can people have? Trucking even to the field. Have enough hired men to truck that many different products to the field and things like that, as well as like when can you take products, because some products will store nicer than others. For example, potash or even nitrogen can be kind of gross, or AMS can be gross. So maybe you want to plan to take those maybe in the spring as opposed to in the fall. Those kinds of things. Questions? Questions on that? All right. Okay, so we'll just kind of talk about the soil sample results. So this is a combination of Congress and Moose Jaw and Rowett so far that we have back. So we had about 396 samples so far. And I just kind of wanted to show this gray bar is the average level. And so I put the average level there. And then the orange one is Congress and the blue one is Moose Jaw if you're looking for more local specific data. And I just kind of want to show these are the critical levels that I typically think about when I'm looking at a soil test result. So if the value is lower than that, then I'll say, okay, we need to start looking at this in your fertility plan. So phosphorus, I typically like to see 10 parts per million or higher, which is about that 22 pounds or higher. Zinc and boron and copper, I typically like to see that 1 ppm or greater. And then chloride, I typically like to see 20 pounds per acre or higher. And so these are the ones that I'm really starting to see are getting deficient. It's kind of averaging at that 1.1 ppm, whereas boron is getting pretty low. Zinc is quite low. Phos, I think we're doing okay for our phos given our pH. I don't expect us to really have any higher levels than that. So I think as long as you're at that 10 ppm or higher, you're probably okay with your phos. And then chloride is one that I'm really noticing is getting low. And that's because it's a mobile nutrient. So it can wash down the soil profile. The other thing is we don't really fertilize potash that often. And that's where we get our chloride from because our soils are naturally derived of potassium. We don't really, like we mine potash, so why would we need to fertilize it? But we are really noticing that chloride levels are getting low and that actually our potassium levels are starting to dip really low as well. So it might be time to start addressing that as well. And just to give you an idea, the average organic matter was around that 3.4 and the average pH was around that 7.5. So I am starting to see that acidification layer on the fertilizer band a lot more around that moose jaw area, whereas Congress is still quite basic, and that's maybe because the mobility of the nutrients. We have a lot sandier soil in Congress versus moose jaw, things like that. Any questions? Just to summarize, we're getting low on zinc, we're getting low on boron, we're getting low on chloride, starting to diminish our potassium reserves, and there's really not a lot of nitrogen left in our soils, which is crazy because I remember in 2018 our soil sample like 200 pounds of residual nitrogen, and now they're coming back at that, that like 30 pounds. So it's good that we're using all of it, I guess. But yeah, okay, so I'll just kind of start to talk about what I've been recommending for addressing these different deficiencies. So in regards to the micronutrients, since you're putting rates of micronutrients that are very, very low because you don't really need that much, you want to make sure that you're putting it in so that each granule kind of has some, so that you're having, instead of like one thing is zinc here and then one thing is zinc over there, that you're having little bits of zinc everywhere just so that the feeding sites are a lot better. You're having better efficiency and uptake. So you're going to want to pick a product that kind of has that homogeneous mixture to it, I guess, so that you're getting that uniform distribution. The other thing to consider when you're looking at forms is, so the oxide form of micronutrients, this needs to be converted into a plant available form. But these sources are really good for building levels as opposed to a sulfite level is that plant available form. So it can be taken up right away. And it's good for addressing immediate deficiencies. So it's just kind of like whatever you need, whatever you're looking for, there are sources for that. And then you'll also see maybe people will advertise chelated forms. This is a process that companies will do to kind of protect the nutrient from binding to other ions when it's applied. It can be a pretty expensive process, so you might see that chelated forms of micronutrients are a little bit more expensive. You might not always need it. For myself, I typically consider chelated products a little bit more in foliar nutrition products, but this would be field specific, depending on what your pH is, kind of what kind of other ions are in the soil, those kinds of things. So yeah, any questions on that? That's typically something I get asked, so. The way I think about chelation is that it's like in a big bubble. And so when you put it on, it's kind of in its little bubble. It's not, you know, there's maybe calcium that's like, hey, zinc, you want to bind together? And the chelation is like, no, sorry, you can't. But yeah, so a couple products that Cargill has to address these micronutrient deficiencies. You could look at Micro Essential Zinc, which is it's a product that has nitrogen, phos, sulfur, and then zinc as well. And each granule has a little bit of zinc. So you are seeing that uniform distribution. If you're looking to address boron deficiencies, we have a product called Aspire. It looks like bacon bits, but it doesn't taste like bacon bits. So really advise not to eat it. But it has potassium chloride and boron on it. And then the other thing that you could look at doing is Yaravita Pro Coat application. This is a canola oil-based product, and it just gets coated onto your fertilizer blend. And there's a couple different products that you can choose from. You can layer different products. So there's a straight boron, a straight zinc, a straight copper, and then there's one I call the multivitamin, which has boron, copper, manganese, and zinc. But if you're just looking for boron and zinc, you can also just layer boron and then add zinc to it as well, or boron and copper. That's a pretty popular one north. So it's kind of a flexible way of doing it so that you can still use your regular fertilizer blend, and you're just coating this product on as well. I'm gonna go into them a little bit further, so if anyone has questions, they can ask too. But I just kind of wanted to talk about some data that we saw. Cargill hosts their own field tests. So these are hosted by other market development agronomists or myself within Cargill, and the company kind of gives us the product, and then they say, okay, here you go, Cargill, go get some experience with the product. So these are all hosted by us and taken care of by us. So I just wanted to share some of the results that we got from the Aspire field test this year, which is that potassium boron product. So we had two sites. We had North Battleford and we had Bruno, and I actually believe we had one in Scott too. But these ones kind of had they had pictures and stuff. So, so these pictures here are from North Battleford. In this treatment, it got 50 pounds of the Aspire side banded. And the agronomist there, Katie, she really saw a nice reduction in flower blast in the canola. But the yield results for that one came back pretty inconclusive. They were pretty much the same amongst the treatments. And then this one here, Bruno, this one was on wheat, and it received 40 pounds of Aspire side banded, and they saw a really nice yield boost from it, about 3 bushels. So that one was a nice success. I did not host one in my area yet, but I'm planning on hosting one next year, so stay tuned. Any questions on that one? And just kind of to share some ProCoat field test results. I had a couple of these this year. We had really good results from them throughout the province. So I just kind of wanted to share some results from this one that was hosted near Gravelburg. What the grower did was he coated 1152 with ProCoat BCMZ at 4 liters per ton. And we saw a 4 bushel increase on his canola yield. Just to give some background on the field, it used to be organic and then it was being converted into conventional. So the organic matter percentage on it was a little bit lower. We kind of knew that it would be probably deficient in micros in a lot of different pockets in the field. So I think that could be why we saw such great results from it as well. To take this field test even further, we added a foliar nutrition product as well and saw really great results from the two of them together. But I didn't want to get too confusing. But if anyone wants to see those results, let me know, I'll send them. Any questions on the field test? Okay, so addressing that potassium chloride deficiency, you could start to use some potash on your cereals or even on your canola, wherever you want to use it. Or you could look at Aspire like we just talked about because it also has chloride in it. So I haven't worked too much with Aspire, so I don't really know what it's like, but I know potash can be pretty gross to work with. So it kind of tends to plug runs in the drill, things like that. So I would recommend that you might want to broadcast it, or you might want to mix it with urea in the sideband. If you are going to mix it with urea, don't take it too early. Same goes for sulfur because it will take in moisture. You might see clumping in the bin, things like that. If you mix it with phosphorus, it's actually a lot easier to use. You can kind of boost up the percentage in the blend a little bit. But your seed safety is reduced, so you can put less phosphorus down. So it is something that you will see really nice results from, especially if you're noticing that maybe you're struggling getting protein on your wheat or your durum. That could be a huge contributing factor to it. You'll also see less lodging. I personally love potassium on barley acres. And yeah, this is also a field test that they had in Bruno, and they saw a really nice yield bump from incorporating that potash, and a really nice protein bump as well. So just to kind of give you some data on that. Usually people who do it don't end up, like, they continue doing it. We typically do it on our cereal years because that's where we kind of see the most response from it, but you can get more. So kind of figure out statistics on how to apply it. It's you'll be happy with it. So the next nutrient I kind of want to talk about, and the reason why I didn't even really summarize the sulfur levels in the soil sampling result summary, is because sulfur levels on a soil test result, I genuinely don't. I usually don't really believe them because there's gypsum in our soils, and that can contaminate the soil sample results quite a bit. So what I do to kind of figure out sulfur levels is I actually kind of just predict them based off of what has the grower been using, what kind of sulfur program have they been using, have they been using any source of elemental sulfur, or has it all been sulfate, things like that. But typically if you have a lower organic matter field, you'll see lower sulfur. If you have those short canola rotations, so maybe instead of every 4 years, you're doing every 2 years, you might see lower sulfur just because canola is kind of sulfur hungry. If you're getting low protein in your cereals, we might want to look at your sulfur program. And the other way I kind of determine rates for sulfur is I look at the N to S ratios, which is the nitrogen to sulfur ratios. And pretty much what they've really found is nitrogen and sulfur work really well together in the plant. They're really responsible for proteins, things like that. And they're noticing, and as you can see from this data, that was from 1974, but it's still nice data. So this is just putting nitrogen, and this is just putting sulfur. But when they put nitrogen and sulfur together, they saw really the best yield response. And that just comes from nutrient interaction. They kind of go up together, and so you kind of want to maintain those nitrogen to sulfur ratios as well. So for canola, I typically use a 5-to-1 N to S ratio, and for cereals, I tend to use a 7-to-1 ratio, but I will occasionally use a 10-to-1 ratio as well. But that 7-to-1 is usually kind of the most average one that you can use. And then for canola, like I said, look at that 5-to-1. And then I'll also look at uptake rates based on yield goals as well, as we discussed before. So the other thing to look at is the sulfur sources. So the elemental versus sulfate. So sulfate is easily leached from the soil. It has a double negative charge, which means that the soil has a really hard time binding to it. Sorry, just a second here. And then the elementals, so it's really leached down. So sulfate, yeah, it's easily leached from the soil. It doesn't bind very good. On the contrary, elemental sulfur needs to be converted into sulfate in order for the plant to take it up. And this can really vary based on time, temperature, and moisture. So it's hard to really predict how much of that elemental sulfur will become sulfate. So you kind of almost want to get a balance where you're kind of mixing some elemental, some sulfate, because the elemental will build your soil levels up so that you have enough sulfur maybe for the next year too. Whereas the sulfate will be ready for the crop and it's ready to take up and you know it's there. So yeah, any questions on that? Regarding placement, you can broadcast it, but it's really not the most efficient use of your nutrient. But it is a thing, like you can broadcast it unless it has, I would watch out for maybe forms that contain nitrogen because you are going to lose that nitrogen unless you're incorporating it. And you could also see leaching of the nutrient as well. So just watch out for leaching sulfate. For broadcasting, I typically recommend like maybe broadcasting an elemental form of sulfur as opposed to a sulfate form. The other thing that you can do is you can seed place some maybe in that sulfate form, and then you can sideband the rest. We typically recommend to use sulfur every year because all crops need sulfur, but also because it'll help you keep your levels where they should be, especially if you're incorporating that elemental form as well. So just some ideas that you could consider is a seed placed S15, and then you could sideband a Metis, which is a nitrogen sulfur product, or you could create your own with a urea AMS blend. Another thing that you could look at is seed placing AMS in 1152, and then maybe broadcasting some Tiger 50. There's a lot of different things you can consider based on logistics and kind of what works for your farm. Any questions on that? Okay, just to kind of give a little 4R plug. So 4R nutrient stewardship, there's 4 R's that kind of depict if you're using your fertilizer correctly in a sustainable way. 4R stewardship is really important for farms, not only because it kind of maximizes your economic return, because you're using your fertilizer in the best possible way properly, but it also helps to make sure that we're kind of minimizing our impact on the environment, and it keeps our options open for marketability because everyone's starting to ask for that sustainable production. So by having this 4R certified crop, you're pretty much putting your stamp on your grain that says, yes, this is sustainably produced. So the way that you can get 4R certified crops is there's agronomists out there that have their 4R certification, like I have it. You have to have your CCA, and what it is you take a class, you take a test, and you understand 4Rs. You show that you're willing to commit to making sure that everyone's using fertilizer in a nice way, and you get this 4R NMS designation. And so those people that have that designation can sign off on your FERT plan that says, yes, this is a 4R crop. So I just kind of wanted to give you an example of what this looks like. If you guys get fertilizer recommendations from us, this is what we'll put on there. And that just shows, yes, this has been checked over by someone that had their 4R designation. Any questions on that? So the last thing I kind of wanted to mention was make sure that you're following up on your fertility. It's one of the biggest investments in your crop. It is probably the most expensive input that you're putting in. So you really want to make sure that you're fertilizing right to achieve your goals. So the way that you can kind of check that is by maybe taking some tissue samples in season just to make sure that your levels are where they're at. And also soil sampling as well, just to watch that you're not depleting or over fertilizing or anything like that. So I really recommend that follow up just to make sure, hey, yes, that, $90 an acre that I spent on my canola is worth it. I am getting what I want out of it. So, yeah. So just to summarize, there's many factors that can depict how you fertilize your field. So if you have a low CEC, maybe you want to feed the crop throughout the season. And if you have a high pH, maybe you want to start banding your phosphorus instead of broadcasting, things like that. You want to feed your crop according to the yield that you want to achieve, and not what you've done historically, because the yield potential of our crops is way different than what it used to be. That maybe like 15 bushel canola crop, or that 30 bushel durum crop. I think you can get a little bit higher than that for the most part now. So you're going to want to start to bump up your fertilizer rates and start feeding all of the nutrients as opposed to just nitrogen and phos, maybe things like that. In our soil test results, we're finding low levels of potassium, chloride, zinc, and boron. For sulfur fertilization, you want to kind of look at that N to S ratio, and it is important for cereals and pulses, so it's good to put sulfur down every year. And yeah, for our nutrient stewardship, make sure that we're fertilizing in a way that we make the most money and we aren't disturbing the environment too much. So yeah, any questions? Any examples people want to go through? Well, if anything does come up, feel free to contact me or your Cargill rep. I'll send out an email with the recording link and maybe some supporting documents just so that you guys can look at those. And yeah, thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and have a good day.